Hi, everybody, and welcome to Matrix Live, Season 4, Episode 20 something. It's me this week, sitting here by myself in the office at 7:30 at night because I have no life, and also because the Mozilla deployment of Matrix has just gone live internally within Mozilla, so that some folks can come up to speed on it before it gets opened up to the general public, hopefully next week. Um, and God, it's been a fun go live. Had at least a couple of hundred people jump onto it so far, and I've been hanging out there handling feedback. It's really fascinating when it turns out that lots of very intelligent techies who build open source software for mainstream users as their day job suddenly jump onto a system, and you get an awful lot of incredibly valuable first time user feedback. And it's stuff that I don't think it's specific to developer feedback, but it's just a lot more articulate and clear than a lot of the, this feels a bit weird, stuff that we get. And it boils into the notification defaults being wrong, that group rooms just shouldn't notify by default, but you do want badges to be able to see what messages have been missed. Also, what else have we seen? The left panel bouncing around, the room list reordering coming up an awful lot. Nobody being able to find the theming settings. People not understanding the terminology of rooms versus groups. Particularly, I think if people are coming from Slack, I mean, it's hilarious. It's basically our first time user experience project incorporated. Frustratingly, one that we haven't been making much progress on. I mean, Travis has been working on it over the last couple of months, but the vast majority of the team, as you probably know, is stuck doing end-to-end encryption by default and cross-signing. So we haven't made as much progress as we want, but hopefully we will be in the very near future. So thank you, Mozillans, if you're reading or watching this, for all of the feedback. We're collating it up on GitHub. In fact, you can even look for a dedicated Mozilla label if you want to see the sort of feedback which this massive influx of users is coming up with. And then, yeah, we turn it on to the wider world, turn on Federation, and see what happens. What else is going on in my life? Or Matrix's life, for that matter. Um, Lots of work, as I said, on cross-signing. It's coming together. We've been working through implementing the new artwork, or the final artwork for shields, and also padlocks. Padlocks mean private rooms, a bit like they do on Slack. Shields mean encrypted. Typically, your private rooms in future will be encrypted, but that's the kind of nomenclature that we're using. Hopefully, it's going to work out. Um, what else is happening on cross-signing? We're seeing if we can get QR codes scanning implemented in the next few weeks before FOSDEM, which would be really nice. So as well as using emoji to compare, to verify people, you can just take your phone and go bleep to scan the QR to verify that a device is actually who it claims it is. And in general, it's just a lot of polishing and work going and plugging it together on all three platforms simultaneously. There's also lots of work happening on P2P. Neil Alexander has been hacking away on Dendrite and got it hooked up to libp2p on Go for the first ever, I think, HTTP, or for the first ever Federation traffic, which is properly point to point. I think that Yorick might have done this as part of his internship over the summer, but as a proxy that sat in front of Synapse, whereas here it is natively part of Dendrite and Go. So he literally, and you can probably see it in the blog post for TWIM, had the first ever federated peer-to-peer traffic there, which is exciting. There was also a big detour trying to get Dendrite to talk to SQLite. It's a bit awkward because when we built Dendrite originally, one of the major design constraints was for it to be Postgres rather than SQLite and only have one backend and to leverage all the funky things which Postgres lets you do in order to be as efficient as possible rather than being dumbed down to poor old SQLite and suffer the problems that we had on Synapse where we tried to cram the same schema, or we tried today to cram the same schema into both Postgres and SQLite, and you kind of get the worst of both worlds between the two. So we've reversed that decision because if we're using Dendrite for lightweight client-side home servers, then it makes a lot of sense to have SQLite. You don't want to spin up a Postgres on your phone or your Raspberry Pi necessarily, or even inside your web browser. Go imagine that, in order to go and have persistence of data. So we had a good stab at switching out Postgres for SQLite and hit some amusing problems just because of, well, first of all, I think the transaction model, I think we might be hitting bugs in the Postgres implementation that SQLite reveals in terms of how transactions work, but also there are a lot of Postgres-y specific things. I think it might almost be there, but it's been parked as a temporary measure to make sure that we have at least a simple demo, which is Dendrite and Postgres talking P2P matrix, available to show off at FOSDEM in a few weeks. But when once that is looking plausible, and it basically already is, the expectation is to go back to replacing Postgres, or at least adding in the SQLite backend. Meanwhile, I've been working on the SQLite driver that stores the data in the JavaScript layer, which is actually WASM of your web browser, so we might be able to do in-browser Dendrite. I've got some travel coming up next week. Hopefully be able to sit on a plane and do some hacking and finish that off, which could be fun. But it'll be really fun to see this happening. Meanwhile, RiotX is accelerating further. I think there was yet another new release, version 13 or not 13, in the stores today, and we now have an F-Droid repo of it, thanks to Marcus Boo Boo. Thank you very much for going and packaging it up for F-Droid. I hear it wasn't easy, and it should be getting more and more stable. However, there are still two classes of fairly nasty bugs happening. First of all, just running out of RAM, like my account on my S6 is pretty crashy. And we're also seeing a surprising number of nasty native C++ segfaults coming out of the depths of Realm, the persistence database that we are using in RiotX. And the fact is that, at least how we're using it today, Realm isn't that fast. And whilst architecturally RiotX should be way faster than Riot Android, we're still spending a lot of time hammering the database. And also these native segfaults turn out to just be bad C++ in the guts of Realm. Specifically, they've got a double free on a mutex, which they eventually found in November, but they still haven't actually released the fix for. So we're in this weird position of trying to decide whether to bet the farm on Realm going forwards, or whilst we switch the entire database backend of Dendrite, also go and switch the entire database backend for RiotX. And so there's a proposal that came up today looking at replacing Realm with SQLDelite, which is an abstraction around SQLite from the nice people at Square. And it's kind of amusing, full circle. The history of data persistence in Android communication apps that this team has built started off in the pre-Matrix thing, which was called Amdocs Unified Communications, and it was written by Keegan originally, who's one of the founding developers of Matrix and wrote all of the bridging stuff, also wrote about a lot of Dendrite, also wrote all sorts of different bits and bobs, wrote Scalar, for instance, the integration manager. Either way, before he was doing Matrix stuff, he wrote the Android app that we had there, and he used SQLite, which has been bundled in Android since 1.0 as an API for all of the persistence. And it was pretty kind of straightforward, almost MVC, that you had your view fragments, you then had the controller layer, and then you had the storage model beneath it. And the storage model was basically a data access object layer that would go and wrap a whole bunch of plain old SQL queries, chuck it into SQLite. It worked pretty well. No, it was really quite nice. Then, when we built Matrix Android SDK, it was a little bit more of a desperate rush to get an Android SDK out. We also didn't want to use any of the code from Amdocs UC due to IP considerations. The intellectual property of that was proprietary, it wasn't open source, it was owned by Amdocs, who we worked for at the time. And so we did a clean room implementation, and in order to get it out quickly, we just used flat file persistence of Java objects for storage, which in theory can be very fast. if you're literally just blatting everything out to disk and you only do it in the right places, it's almost an optimal solution until you have to start doing anything relational at all. And a lot of the performance problems that Riot Android pre-Riot X had was due to just this increasingly unwieldy, dumb storage layer. And in fact, that was where Riot X came from. We thought, hey, are we going to go and work out how to refactor the storage layer in Riot Android and add one in, or should we just write a new app which has a proper storage abstraction from the outset? That's where Riot X came from. So here we are now with Riot X almost ready to go live, but we've got a segfaulting database layer which isn't being maintained particularly well, and empirically is a lot slower than SQLite, at least for how we're using it today. We're also unable to use a lot of the funkier lazy loading support that Realm gives you due to the overall data flow that Riot X has ended up with. So here we are going full circle all the way back to 2012, going and looking at using SQLite as a data layer. Now, this transition, if it happens, and it probably will, I guess, is probably going to happen over the course of like a month, which is going to push back Riot X being good for proper prime time. I don't know, we might even ship it with Realm as like a 1.0 and then follow it with a 1.1 afterwards to make it go even faster, because we can also backport the fix from the mutex crash and do stuff like that to get it out the door. Haven't decided yet, but suffice it to say that it's getting a lot better. I hear we have member profiles, we have room lists. Not all the buttons are hooked up, but the important ones are. And it's starting to feel like a real boy. And we're starting to get feedback from people like randoms on Twitter saying, oh my God, there's actually a good Matrix client for Android, which is always nice to hear. So that's what's happening on Riot X. Meanwhile, Riot Web, mainly cross-signing, although we do have an entirely new build infrastructure system that Travis has put together. I think this is mainly upgrading to Babel 7, and it means that we have source maps which work again for debug purposes, which is very, very useful, so you can step through your code reliably. I think it's also faster and has potential to do dead code analysis and basically link all of the three layers of the Riot Web stack, JS SDK, React SDK, and Riot Web in more efficiently into one great big blob. But primarily the aim was to switch to the most recent tooling and fix source maps, which we now have. Exciting. What else is happening? Seshat is looking good for end-to-end search. Fixed, I think, all of the issues which were remaining on it, although I haven't checked for sure with Demir, but it's looking okay. What else? Doing a lot of interviewing. For me, at least, my week has basically been spent in this lovely goldfish bowl of a meeting room, getting more and more carbon dioxide going on. We even got our little carbon dioxide sensor, although it's not plugged in right now. But you can see how much hot air I'm emanating if I go and plug it in. And finally, we've got interesting work going on. Oh, hello, Shirley. You met Shirley before? I think Amandine did a story with Shirley. A twin with Shirley once. This is Shirley. Shirley is like one of the most important members of the team. She mainly sits here and surprise interviewees, particularly like high-profile executives looking for a new role at New Vector. Clearly, what they expect to see is this loaf going and saying hello. Also, Shirley normally wears a Matrix t-shirt, except it got a bit dirty, so it's been put in the wash. And as a result, it's a little bit disturbing that Shirley is wandering around in the buff. Anyway, what was I saying? UICs. We obviously, to turn on E2B by default, we want to make damn sure that we can always decrypt the messages. And I did a bunch of work analyzing the root causes of these. Hubert then went through implementing a lot of that. And in fact, on Develop, you might start seeing on Riot Web much, much better explanations of why messages cannot be decrypted, which makes it a little bit more palatable. He's currently going through hiding ones where it was a feature that you couldn't decrypt them, like you weren't in the room, for instance. But meanwhile, Eric has been on a really amazing mission on Xenapps, going through, looking at the UIC code, figuring out what the root causes of a lot of the residual issues that we've seen. And it's things like the retry policy not being quite correct for device list updates, not recovering rapidly enough after federation failures, getting queued behind PDUs, which are the like persistent events, and a whole bunch of other interesting PLs are flying around, including ones. Oh, and we also found a major performance problem on JSSDK where it was creating new sessions unnecessarily for devices. I forget the details, but basically it turns out that we've been doing a lot more work than we should have been whenever the megaom session for a room rotates. So occasionally when you're chatting in an end-to-end encrypted large room, you have to wait like 10 seconds whilst it goes and encrypts for a new version of the megaom ratchet. So apparently that can be sped up by 2 or 3. I think Hubert found that one. So lots of last minute improvements and performance stuff happening on end-to-end. Anyway, that's a total random brain dump of what is happening in the run-up to FOSDEM. And we shall see in the next couple of weeks how much stuff lands in time. And also we'll see next week how Mozilla works for the world. And I think that's probably it for me. Thanks for flying, Matrix. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye.